Excellent. Well, I'm going to start recording and we're going to start off this first track here. It's a little after 9:46 and we are broadcasting from the Rebel base in North Carolina here in Charlotte, where it's a beautiful day. And I hope you guys are all enjoying a good day as well. What I want to do here is start sharing the presentation that we've got for today. We're going to talk a little bit about risk and talking to the board. I'm pretty excited about this topic. It's something I've been talking to a lot of people about over the last couple months, is how do you talk about risk to the board and what's the right thing to do? I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of different aspects of that today. So we'll get started here. I'm going to tell you a quick story about how I first started thinking about risk this way. Talk about two perspectives from the CISO and the CFO and where we are in kind of the history of things. A couple of ways of talking about quantifying risk. We'll go through those. What I'm talking about is the probability of a material impact is one method. What I'll call detection, investigation, and response, the FAIR method that probably a lot of you have heard of. And then we'll talk about a couple other things that I see and some key takeaways to just wrap everything up. I'll try and keep an eye on the chat window as well and see if I can see anything else that's going on here as we go through today. Let's see. Always fun getting used to the all the pieces here. So my story, I started working in information security at the National Security Agency, and we used to build little green boxes to secure radio communications and then network communications. And every time we designed and built a new box and started going into production and distribution, sharing it with the military, we built a little graph like this that, surprise, surprise, on one axis would talk about the likelihood of an event happening, and on the other axis would talk about the impact of that happening. And invariably, we knew that there were some attacks against a device that might or might not have an impact, that we could manage against with other controls, that we could manage in the environment. But the one thing that always stood out was there's always this one opportunity for a new zero-day attack to show up. And when some new zero-day attack shows up, you don't really know what to do with it. So you have to figure out how are you going to manage around that new unknown. And it was interesting because we'd always have the small possibility of a big new unknown that would completely screw up any of the calculations that we were trying to do around risk. And 25 years later, that hasn't changed. We still have to deal every day with knowing that some new random thing might happen that completely throws off everything we're doing. But even with that said, there are a lot of things that we can do and a lot of things that we want to do to continue to manage risk and to talk to our boards and our executives and our leadership about that. So the one thing that we can talk about is a difference between the CFO and the CISO. So if you're the new CFO and you walk into an organization and you already kind of know what a balance sheet looks like, that balance sheet has been developed for almost 7,000 years, maybe longer, since the ancient Mesopotamians started keeping track of accounting. We've been building to the point where the CFO's job is pretty well defined. The metrics that they use, the way they talk to the board and other managers is very well defined. At the same time, if you walk into a new CISO, the job there is completely undefined. Almost everything you walked into, the CISO has a new strategy. And in fact, I saw an article the other day that says every new CISO who walks in, stops all the activity, builds their own strategy, starts it off in a new direction. And of course, on average, something like 3 years later, they leave a new CISO comes in, starts it all over again, and they all build different ideas about how they talk about things, what they should talk about. And talking about the program or talking about risk is unfortunately no different. We have a lot of different ways to talk about this. So as I've been thinking about this and talking to people, I've noticed that a couple of things really start to happen. One is you want to think about how you communicate risk from the perspective of relevance to the board. And you want to talk about risk from the perspective of relevance to the solutions that you're going to present. So if you're building a risk discussion, you want to be able to say, is it relevant to the board? And does it help prescribe what I need to do to fix things? What do I need to do to make things better? And as I put the ideas and solutions I've been talking about with people on this kind of chart, I find that there's some interesting things. One is that talking about the material risk and forecasting risk for the next 3 years, really good and relevant to the board, really good numbers, but not necessarily very prescriptive about what you should do to fix things. Talking about the mean time to detect, the mean time to investigate, the mean time to respond to some event or incident that your systems detect is a really good way of starting to look at how all of the program comes together, how all the pieces fit, but it doesn't necessarily tell you if you do this, the mean time to investigate will go down. If you do this, the mean time will respond to go down. It leaves open kind of where you can go from here. If you go through the FAIR process, which is a lot more intensive, and some of you are probably doing that, FAIR is a lot more prescriptive because you've captured risk in a robust way, because you've put quantitative numbers around it. You can very quickly start to use FAIR to say, here's a high risk, something that has a high likelihood of impact and a high impact when it does. And I can directly then say that's a risk that I want to put controls around, and I can be very prescriptive about what to do with it. Two other things that often come out, the 10K, and if you've never read a 10K, you should certainly look at your own company's 10K filing with the SEC. But 10K talks about risks that the organization faces at a very executive level. And sometimes they'll talk a little bit about cyber risk. And I'll show you an example in a minute there. Again, the problem with that is it really doesn't help you say what to do to fix things. It just says there's a risk. And then a lot of companies build very detailed risk registers. And those very detailed risk registers can be very, very prescriptive, but they're almost completely irrelevant to the board because there's so much noise in them. So many things that you can talk to about that. So let's talk about a couple of these methodologies. Rick Howard has been talking a lot about this probability of a material impact in the next 3 years. He's given a couple talks at the RSA conference about it. And it really is a pretty cool idea and concept that actually the math that drives it really makes it work so that you can build these loss exceedance curves and talk about what your big risks look like and the risk and likelihood of an impact. And this could be built from a small number of risks, or it could actually be built from a complete set of FAIR type risks, very comprehensive, very extensive. You use your internal experts to estimate the probability of an impact, your confidence in that probability and the impact, and then use the math of Bayes' theorem and computers to do Monte Carlo simulations to build out these loss exceedance curves. And you get to see how everything works. I'm going to stop sharing for just a minute because I haven't figured out how to, there we go. Just making sure I've got no open questions. So I've got questions ready here to see. If you have any questions, please feel free to jump in. But the ideas here are pretty good, and it gives you a way of really mapping something. And you can look here and very quickly say, For a given set of risks, we either believe that the risk tolerance is okay, we're willing to accept $1 million, maybe a little more than $1 million dollars of impact to the organization in the next 3 years. And as the probability goes down or risk is reduced, I can stay under that risk tolerance curve or find things that are above the risk tolerance curve. It provides a very robust way of thinking through things that you can talk to the board about and have a good conversation without them having to be cyber experts. The next thing, and this is something that Dmitry Alperovich has talked to people about and shared with me, is this mean time to detect, mean time to investigate, and mean time to respond. This is something that a lot of us have been using as a metric for looking at how well our Security Operations Center works. But when you put together the detect, investigate, and respond numbers, it actually gives you a pretty good picture of the whole program. But it also misses things just a little bit. If you think about that NIST cybersecurity framework that we all know and love, there's that opportunity to identify and focus on the crown jewels, not on detecting that everything is protected, but detecting that the most important things are protected. Establishing the controls, it really doesn't, this mechanism doesn't directly tell you whether or not you have the right mix of controls. Do you have controls every place you could or should? But it does give you an indirect measure of whether or not your protective measures are working, because obviously somebody has to get through those before you can detect an event. And then you can build on that to think about red team and adversary activity. You can use those to actually get some numbers. So even if your adversaries aren't getting through or you're not seeing the detection of them, you can see what your ability to detect the red team is and use that. Investigation time, obviously a big piece of starting the response to a detected event. And then responding to those events, you can start to measure how long it takes you to measure those. One of the interesting side discussions that I've had while I was investigating that was actually the question of, would I look at average time or mean time to detect? Would I look at 90th percentile, recognizing that there are always going to be some events that take a lot longer to detect because of an adversary's approach, or that it may take me longer to respond to certain kinds of events, but those aren't the events that I have every day. Those are the weird events that happen once a year or less than once a year. The other thing you can do with this, of course, is use the MITRE ATT&CK framework and kind of work your way through at least a paper exercise to say, how long would it take me to detect each of the attack scenarios in MITRE? How long would it take me to investigate those? What tools do I need to add to protect, detect, and respond to each of the opportunities that could be identified by using the MITRE ATT&CK framework? So some really interesting things there. The last major way of talking about risk and building something that I think you can take to the board is the FAIR approach. And the FAIR Institute and Jack Johnson have been out there for a long time, or Jack Jones have been out there for a long time talking about and building out this risk approach with the idea of analyzing the factors that address what's the loss event frequency, what's the loss magnitude, and how do those things come together from known information so that you can build a better, more quantitative or deeply qualitative view of what risk looks like. And then break that down or build it up from the bottom around specific risks that you identify. And the idea that I see in FAIR that's interesting is that you don't try and enumerate every single possible risk. You try and look at it systemically across the organization, around crown jewels, around important systems, and look at specific cyber risks that you articulate. And a little bit of the art of FAIR, as I see it, is in finding the right way to articulate specific risks and articulating those risks in a very consistent way. FAIR really tries to use a specific methodology for the way that you articulate risks. And that's an area that I think anyone here can investigate and go deeper into. Those are the three big methods that I found where there are really different approaches to thinking about risk. All of them, and communicating that risk to the board, all of them have some interesting aspects. All of them have different levels of ease of implementation. There's fast track things you can do, things that take more time, but they all provide a different approach. The other thing that I want to talk about is the two other things that you sometimes see as a ways of talking about risk. I'm not going to name them, but this is the actual statement about cyber risk from a Fortune 50 company. And it talks about cyber risk in kind of an interesting way. I'm not going to read it, but it represents different kinds of failures or breaches in security. It talks about malicious attacks. It talks about the core confidentiality, availability, integrity that we always talk about with systems. It talks about getting to sensitive data, corporate and customer information. It talks about enabling preventative, detective, and responsive measures, so picks up some of the NIST cybersecurity framework. Talks about an enterprise risk committee and a board and a global information security team. And the interesting thing here is I think you could cut and paste this into the 10K for every single company I've ever worked with. It's just a fascinatingly bland risk statement, and it's something that you could take to the board, but it doesn't really help the board to understand, is our program in control? Are we spending the right amount of money? Are we doing the right things? What else do we need to do? So all of these approaches can be very interesting. Whoops. So anyway, whoops. Wanted to love the Q&A thing. It just got me flustered here. So this 10K risk is very interesting in the approach that it gives you to talking about risk at a high level, but again, doesn't really go into much detail and give you much meat to chew on. The other thing that you see a lot, and a lot of companies have this, is some kind of risk enumeration or a risk register. It's funny, if you Google risk register, how many templates are available for download for Excel, Word, and other capabilities to build out a risk register. And of course, that risk register is a key function of literally every GRC tool that you find. And it lets you capture description of risk. It lets you capture something about the likelihood and the impact, severity, owners, mitigating actions. It's a good way of tracking risk at a very detailed level. It's useful within the information security organization. It's useful when talking to IT organizations or business organizations and capturing their individual risks and tracking those through from initial identification of the risk through the process to closing out the risk and getting it to an acceptable level through mitigation, through transferring risk, through implementing additional controls, or just agreeing that it's within tolerance and you can accept it. So the risk register is useful as a tool for working level activity, but it's not really something you can take to the board. And summary numbers from this, we're tracking 5,253 risks and 119 of them are high, doesn't really tell the board anything useful. So really useful for tracking and managing risk at a working level, but not very useful for taking anything on up. With that, let me flip to just a couple of other things. One of the other things that comes up when I have risk discussions with people is measurements and metrics. What metrics should you be taking to the board? How do you know that you've got the right things to go to the board? Are you taking the right things to the board? Metrics is a whole separate discussion, but but I think measuring risk and talking about risk in the right way is critical to having good conversations with the board about what you are and aren't doing to manage the risks that are appropriate for the organization at a level that you can talk to the board about, to help them understand where you are in setting up a program expectations and how the program is addressing the likelier risks and the ability of the organization to withstand an event, and thinking about it there from a response and recover perspective. I thought these two Peter Drucker quotes are really good because you have to be able to measure risk to improve it. You have to think of risk as one of the measures that you share with the board, that you talk about your information security program. But risk isn't the only measure of an information security program, and it's not the only thing that you would want to be talking to the board about. The other thing here, of course, is just key, right? Management is making sure everybody's doing the right things, that you're doing things right. Leadership is figuring out which are the right things to do and which are the right things to focus on. So a good risk management system, a good discussion of risk with the board, and a mechanism from one of these choices or possibly something else that you build would help you have the right conversation to figure out what are the right things to do so that you can address risk. And I think this is one of the most important pieces, is presenting the information to the board shouldn't be a presentation. It should be a conversation with the board that helps them better understand the risk that you're working on, and helps you better understand what their concerns and priorities are. It should be a dialogue, not a presentation. Last thing here, a couple of takeaways. There are many ways to talk about risk, probably too many ways to talk about risk. I think it would be very helpful if we could all start to coalesce as an information security community and program on one or two methods that we use consistently. I think we can use some different methods at different levels of the organization. And I think it's important for us to start to coalesce to help make the CISO a more professional, more consistently C-level executive. We've got to help build more consistency, not so that it's easier for CISOs to move from one place to the next, or it's easier for a CISO to move in, but so that it's easier for boards to consistently understand and set expectations, what the CISO should be bringing to them, what we're bringing to the CISO, to the board, so that we're able to talk more consistently about our programs with executives and business leaders outside of the information security community. Second, of course, organizations are all very different today. We need to be a lot more consistent. We need to be able to help people that aren't going to spend all their time learning the nuances of 50 new attacks this week understand how the program provides risk management for the organization and helps the business take appropriate risks to grow and thrive in the business that you're in. Fourth, I'd say go try applying one of these methods. They're all good. There's some value in all of them, but I think if we can start to coalesce around a couple of methods that are used more consistently, and we see people having success and lessons learned through presentations like this and the application of these risk methods, that we'll start to find what works in more detail and what else is coming up. And so fifth, let me know what you learn. I've been finding out a lot by talking to people and working with several individuals. I see a lot of discussions of vendors thinking about how to better capture risk and think about risk management. This is the opportunity for us to learn and find some things and continue sharing with the community. The slides, of course, will be available afterwards. You can reach out to me in a number of different ways. And at this point, I'd like to open it up for questions.
Hey, Todd, thank you. Let's see, if we have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box. Well, Todd, I don't see any additional questions coming in, but I really appreciate your time today, and I want to thank you for talking on a topic that I know is important to a lot of us. Thanks everyone for attending. We will be starting up the next presentation at 9:30 Central. Thank you, Todd.
Thanks, John. Pleasure to be here.